Elysium is pure science fiction. The satirical nature of Elysium is my favorite part of the film, which is the idea of putting exorbitant, ridiculous mansions on a space station. The way that it reinforces the theme, when you take that realistic scientific concept and then you cake it with wealth and diamonds, it becomes something I want to make a film about. In the 1970s, NASA held this conference to try to come up with the most viable way to habitat humans in space. What is the most habitable, realistically buildable thing you can build in space to move a portion of humans off Earth? And so in the 70s, Stanford University won out the design for that concept and came up with the idea for this thing called the Stanford Torus. There's this kind of cool thing that, you know, now that I'm a functioning filmmaker, I kind of realize that if I want to, I can actually work with some of the people that were really inspirational to me when I was young. And Sid Mead was absolutely one of those people.
I'd done inverse perspective environments for a long, long time. And in fact, one of Neil's favorite paintings of mine, I'd done for National Geographic a long time ago. And it showed this inverse world with the terrain curving up essentially out of sight.
Even if he had not drawn the National Geographic image of the space station, I would be there anyway. But when you combine the image of the space station with that love of his design work, it's like a no-brainer. The second I realized that, I was like, we should try to get Sid Mead to do the design of Elysium.
Well, the process working with Neil on some of the sets was that I would do a sketch, just 8.5 by 11 typewriter paper. That's how I start, because ideas have no scale until you assign scale to them. So the idea is very critical, and I would do a fairly quick pen sketch, email that to him.
A lot of the time you could get concept artists that have only ever sort of been sketching in Photoshop, you know, with a Wacom tablet, and haven't ever handled like physical mechanical objects. There's something about Sid and his age and his experience and the fact that, you know, he's hand drawing it with ink on paper, that it's just, his brain is just working differently, you know, and the work that comes back reflects that kind of different algorithm. And it's very, very refreshing.
Sid was very involved in designing a lot of the imagery and the sort of baseline aesthetic for Elysium. Concept art, concept drawings, small things like the exhaust pipes to large things like what the actual torus would look like. And all through that, Phil Ivey, who's our production designer, was working in concert with him.
Neil and I have been Sid Mead fans forever. His work on Blade Runner, through Tron, everything else is, from a design standpoint, is gold. You'll see Sid's main contribution is in the overall geometry of the control room and the briefing room. And they're two of my favorite sets in the film.
And on Elysium, there were sets that Sid didn't get to that Phil would design. And, you know, he would use a lot of Sid's angles, and they all felt like they belonged to the same family. And he would also take Sid's concepts and then extrapolate them into sets. Like one example of a set that was Sid was the CCB, where Phil just, you know, turned that into reality.
The way I did it was to do a sketch, you know, face on, and sort of this, and make the ramp system sort of radiate out from a center point. And the hierarchical arrangement was people doing sort of mundane response. We were down lower, and the managers are higher up, which is sort of a graphical interpretation of hierarchical design.
And then there'd be other sets where Sid hadn't touched them. Phil would kind of think through Sid's eyes and bring those to life. And then on Earth, it would just be Phil and I.
Sid Mead's designs formed a basis and an influence of what Neil and the art department and we in visual effects were imagining the ring would be. A lot of his work also informed some of the finer details, just the shapes and patterns of the paneling, like on these enormous space station.
His particular way of angles that he uses, his lines, his offsetting of colors and patterns. So we created basically a Sid Mead style guide. So we collected all of that information that we love about Sid Mead and looked at his old drawings and sketches over the years. And we're really inspired by that, and then applied that same mentality and thinking in designing things like the ring or Elysium itself.
We had to imbue Sid's, beautiful, elegant designs of Elysium with a practical, workable mentality, trying to bring a sense of reality to these very sci-fi images. So we looked at things like the Yangtze River Dam project, where you see construction on a massive scale. We looked at all kinds of superstructures, bridges, skyscrapers, transoms of all kinds of sorts, to try to bring a sense of what engineering in today's world can accomplish, that the audience subconsciously understands that this structure could exist. And I think that was one of the biggest challenges, trying to convert very science fiction images into something that the audience will accept and believe is possible.
The rules, when you're doing a future, first you have to find out what the technological parameters are. What does this society know how to do? How does this fit into maybe some sort of a socioeconomic format? That's critical. And of course, that's the story. If the story is well written, that's how the story is set. That's the stage. So I did this cross section to get the scale. If it's this far from here to here, then a house is that big, or streets or whatever.
Sid's ideas often would go to speculative fiction and to making it, like, just building it correctly. And then I would steer it back to more metaphor. Like, I'd be like, no, it's actual mansions on space. Because you could imagine building a space station like that and building like these super high-tech, like hexagonal living areas, and that's appealing. Like, a lot of the time I would see that and I would start thinking in that direction. But the second I feel like you do that, you take away the metaphor.
He said, this is supposed to be Beverly Hills in space. Think about making it a little bit more pastoral. So he sent me aerial shots of Beverly Hills, and he said, sort of scale it to this, with the streets and the mansions. So I found out how big a tennis court is, regulation tennis court, and started to scale these mansions, how big they were, in the shot that Neil sent me. And that gave me a clue, because now I could match it up to my scale across the breadth of the rotational torus.
And so that was the thing with Sid, where he would bring ultra-real JPL aerospace ideas, and I would bring metaphor. We would kind of clash with one another and then figure out this kind of middle ground.
My strong suit, I guess, is that having an industrial design background, I can theoretically imagine how this might be made given a series of theoretical possibilities of manufacture. Because if you know the process anyway in the real world, then you move ahead and say, okay, now we can make things in one piece that are a mile long or whatever it happens to be. And that influences how it looks, because things look the way they do because of how they're made.
When Neil talks about Elysium, he doesn't talk about it as a science fiction imaginary world. He talks about it as Bel Air in space. And so all of the models for Elysium were not futuristic, futurist theory. It was, what is Bel Air? What are the most expensive, most garish homes and buildings in the world look like?
If you imagine trying to transplant Hollywood Hills into space on a much grander canvas, then that's sort of what we're trying to achieve.
And we shot plates for Elysium of Bel Air, Beverly Hills, a lot of places in Los Angeles that if you live in Los Angeles, or certainly if you live in those areas, you'll recognize.
And how would that work when you wrap it on the inside of this torus? And things like, how high are the mountains, and how prominent are the bodies of water, and is it all sparse mansions, or are they clustered in communities, and how much public buildings and sort of city areas, and is there any visible public transport?
We went around a few times on how light, how bright, how dark, how sci-fi is too sci-fi and how real is too real. And so you're constantly finding that balance between something that people aren't being disturbed by, but people are wowed by.
There's all these questions that start coming up as soon as you really dig into what is that shot going to look like when the camera is low enough to the surface to really get a feel for what that geography looks like.
We have a whole mix of mansions through there. One thing we're saying is money doesn't necessarily buy taste. So we have a lot of your faux Tuscan mansions through to your Malibu modern, which is a style I really like, through to your ultra modern mansions that you're seeing now, mainly in concept stuff, but are starting to be realized as construction techniques have progressed. So we have a whole raft of architectural styles there. But there, there is a base style to the whole thing. There is an architectural plan, but within it, there are pockets of different styles of architecture that you would see on Earth.
We didn't necessarily make up too many sci-fi elements. Neil definitely wanted a level of realism in that environment that people would question.
But what I enjoyed most working on Elysium was working with Neil, not just in making movies, but in the art of design and the techniques that he uses and the trust that he was putting in me to sort of invent, to a certain extent, how his film would look.
The challenge of building Elysium as an environment and as a believable space was the thing that we were the least knowledgeable about at the start of the process, and the thing that we had to become the most knowledgeable about by the time we completed it.
Usually in science fiction, you have one or the other. It's dystopic or it's utopic. And with Neil, you get both, and they're warring with each other the way that they are in the real world right now. So Elysium was this sort of pure expression of the suburbs and the excess.
This realistic concept of the Stanford Torus, a functioning space station that is a self-contained biosphere, that's what I was interested in, was something that was like that, but then again the metaphor kicks in and it's a little bit bigger and it's a little bit more lavish and a little bit more ridiculous, but it's based on something that is sort of realistic.